In this section of our study, I want to look at time and how we calculate time. Now, if you picture time as being Adam and Eve being created or creation starting, and then a long line of almost 6,000 years going by, and you had to tell people where Jesus was born, but we didn't have BC and AD, how would you describe that? How would you tell people where a certain event took place in history? Well, that's been the problem throughout history of how to tell people in a chronological way what happened throughout the history of the world. Back in Moses' day, they didn't have dates. They didn't say Moses was born in such and such a date and died in such and such a day, because they didn't have the dates. Nobody was measuring time as that. Time just went by. So there was a period in time in which people had to invent a way of measuring time. My question for you is, how would you do it? If you could do it differently than BC and AD, how would you do it? Where would you put an anchor bolt down to begin to start calculating time, either backward or forward? It is interesting to know that in times gone by, they didn't have that kind of timeline. They didn't have the BC and AD. But what they had is they called it the era of the Egyptians, the era of the Chinese, era of the Olympiads, era of the foundation of Rome, the era of Nebuchadnezzar, the era of Alexander, the era of Tyre, and on it goes, the era of different people that were kings. But they couldn't give a contiguous line of what the events were that took place. And so somebody had to invent a way of defining time more specifically. And that began with the Greeks, and they decided to mark time and make a specific point in time the beginning of the Olympics. And so the Olympics began in July 13th, 776 BC. We know it as BC, but they didn't. They fixed that. That's the time at which all other time is related. The forward time and backward time would be from the Olympics. Later on, it was Rome, and Rome said, let's do it from the foundation of Rome, and that happened at the 21st of April in 753 AD, and they kind of established that for a little while, but that wasn't good enough either. It took a long time for people to come to terms with how to describe the length of time and when certain things took place. And so it was in 532 AD, 532 years after Christ, that a young monk named, his name is Dennis the Short, so I'm going to call him Dennis the Short. Dennis was a short monk, and he invented a way of measuring history by the birth of Christ. And so he estimated the time that they thought Christ was born, and then they fixed that time as AD 1. And everything after that is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to 2021. And everything behind that date of Christ's birth is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and out into infinity of however long before the creation took place. So that's how we got the BC. BC is before Christ, and AD is after Christ, or it's after Christ, Anno Domini, which is the year of Christ. And so we have a point of reference for history, both forward and back. And it was a very ingenious way to do it. But that's not the only thing. In your notes, I give you a timeline so that you can actually see that and kind of visualize it. It might help you in determining. Of course, today, in our secular world, we don't call it BC and AD. We call it BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, which is the Common Era, CE being AD. It's a rather confusing method, but that's what we have. Then there were the developments of calendars. Do you ever see a calendar? Wow. Calendars are great to have, but we didn't always have them, and people had to invent them. It was back in Julius Caesar's day that he invented a calendar and tried to put things together, but they were having 8-day weeks. Can you imagine 8-day weeks? Yeah, they didn't have the Lord's Day like we have. They didn't have Sabbath, but they had 8 days, and the 8th day was market day, and everybody marked everything by the market day. and how many market days things were. And so Julius Caesar came up with a calendar, and with his wise men around him, they improvised that it was going to be 12 months and 30 or 31 days. The problem with his calendar was it was falling off each year by 11 minutes and 14 seconds. And by the year 1580, the equinox fell on March 11th instead of March 21st. There was a 10-day difference, so they had to skip and make up for that 10-day difference. Then we came up with the Gregorian calendar. About a year after that problem, they came up with the Gregorian calendar, which corrected it and put in a leap year. But then you had to adjust for the Julian calendar, so you had to make up for some time. And as it happened in 1752, can you imagine that, during our founding of our nation and during George Washington's time, they had to make up for some lost time. And so in that year, 1752, Wednesday, September 2nd, was followed by Thursday, the 14th of September. Now, if you were born somewhere between September 2nd and 14th in 1752, you wouldn't be born. At least you wouldn't have a date, because the 3rd to the 13th didn't exist anymore. Really confusing and tough stuff. Then we have the Jewish calendar, and when we come to the New Testament and the Old Testament, they were going by a different calendar than we go by, and their calendar was 360 days, and that will become significant when we start calculating the prophecies of Daniel. But the Jewish calendar is different than ours. As a matter of fact, this year of 2021-2020, they call it 5781. That's the year since Adam's birth. You see, some of their wise philosophers and rabbis figured out all the genealogies going back, and they determined that 0 date was the date that Adam was born, and so it happened on Monday, September 6th. And that's when Rosh Hashanah takes place, on September 6th this year. But who would calculate the beginning? How would you figure out when Adam was born? Even if you had the AD and BC, how would you figure out how many years? Well, many theologians have tried to do that. There was John Lightfoot that tried it, and he said that Adam was born on September the 12th, 3928. He had calculated through the genealogies and figured that out. Well, his didn't become very popular, but Archbishop Usher did the same kind of thing, and Bishop Usher came up with the dates that most of us are familiar with. He said that Adam was born on Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC, precisely at noon. Now, how do you know that? I don't know. It's guesswork. So when we're talking about BC and going back to Adam's time, we don't know how long that was. Even if you follow the genealogies, they often skipped persons in the genealogy for memory purposes. Look at Matthew. Matthew has the genealogy all the way back to Adam, but it divides up in 14 equal segments so that you could remember it. That means they were not always citing everybody. Every schoolboy and schoolgirl had to memorize their genealogy all the way back to Adam. That's pretty tough, but it's the way that they came about with the idea of when Earth started.